All right, we are back on the podcast where we are training men in spiritual fitness. I am Evan McGinty here with my friend Joe Barnard. How are you, my friend?
We're doing well. We're doing well. A few days to go until presents get unwrapped and all the craziness ends. So I'm excited for the day to come and yeah, enjoying the holiday festive season right now.
Yes, the Christmas season is busy, and that is where we find ourselves in the midst of the last few days leading up to Christmas. And we want to spend this time, not lightly. We're going to just go all in on a subject, Joe, that you and I have been wrestling with for a while, and kind of had conversations back and forth on. Nothing too big. Just what does it mean to be a man? That's we we have been wrestling with this idea. What is biblical masculinity? And it's not just us that are wrestling with this. We get asked this question a lot, right? We run a men's ministry. We are ministering to men all over the world and trying to help them to grow in godliness. And so this comes up. Well, what exactly does it mean to be a man in the Bible? What does the Bible say about being a man? And this is something even culturally that's, I think, man, a hot topic in a lot of ways. And so. I guess we just have finally decided, you know what? Let's go. Let's face it head on. I have a lot of my own curiosities about this right now, and reasons why personally I want to pursue a clear answer to this. But let me just start by asking you, why do you want to find a clear answer to this question? What does it mean to be a man biblically?
I think there's multiple reasons, and I think guys listening will be able to identify with various ones. I've got three sons,
Yeah.
growing up in a very different world even than I grew up in, and with questions that things that, in a sense, were passed down, not always even consciously, unconsciously, have become questioned, and there's second guessing and uncertainty. And so, I think fathers out there are looking for ways to articulate
Yeah.
subjects that our dads and grandparents didn't talk about explicitly. But beyond that, I think, because it's a live question, that means that there's a lot of voices speaking into it.
Yeah.
And a lot of them aren't that good. I mean, I'm really surprised the more I listen into conversations of people, Christian, non-Christian, trying to talk about masculinity, how unhelpful so much of the advice is.
Yeah.
And in some cases, it's too general. They don't say enough to be useful,
Mhm.
or they say too much. And now
Mm.
they're kind of pushing guys into narrow cubby holes. That's not helpful. And so
Mhm.
to actually find like a biblical framework um, is hard and difficult. And so that's why I think if guys can come on a journey with us, as we learn, if they learn with us, I think that could be useful for them and also for the guys around them.
Yeah, yeah, we've got sons. Also, we have daughters. You have a daughter. I have three daughters, and I'm interested in men for that reason as well. What does it mean to be a biblical man? I want to teach my sons, raise my sons to be that kind of man, and also train my daughters to look for those kind of men. I also have within me, be honest, yeah, I think that. There's a lot of times we don't ask this question or want to pursue a clear answer to this question of what does it mean to be a biblical man, because we fear we may not meet the definition of what it means to be a man. There's something within us that says, "Am I good enough? Well, I fit this definition," and that is why we sometimes go to these hot voices all around our culture and looking for different definitions of what it means and am I that type of man? And but there's just not, like you said, there's not a lot of good advice, I think, really biblically out there that's clear. And so yeah, I'm curious. I want us to go on a journey to find that. We need to let guys know from the get-go. It's not like we have a very clear, perfect definition right now. I don't know. Maybe you do, Joe. You have a perfectly thought out, well-lived definition of what it means to be a biblical man. Can you just give that to me in like 3 words or less, you know?
Like I said, we're going on a journey, guys. Come with
Okay.
us.
Yes. I will say just briefly, so I started this morning, this was my pre-podcast research. This is the extent of it. I Googled, what does it mean to be a man? And I let Google AI answer it for me. And just interestingly enough, here's what it says. Part of it says, this definition is highly subjective and can vary greatly depending on individual perspectives and cultural norms. And you know what? I think Google's a little right there, actually. There is some subjectiveness that we see in a lot of this, and that's part of what we want to fight through. Is like, okay, let's get some clarity here. Let's go on a journey to find out. How do we begin to discover what is the truth? How do we begin to fight through kind of the what's just hot topics on the internet and just get, begin to discover what does it really mean to be a man? What has God called us to? So the approach we're taking to doing this is we've just chosen some books that are out there on manhood, and we're just going to start reading them, and then yeah, try to see what's the good and the bad, and how do we begin to identify biblical masculinity through that. So we're starting this week with this book, The Masculine Mandate. By Richard Phillips. And so, Joe, you and I read this, and I'm mostly going to quiz you on the book because, you're way better at describing uh, and taking information and putting it out there. But let's just kind of walk guys through this book and what it's pitching as the masculine mandate. What does it mean to be a man? And what are some things that we think guys should take away from this? So let me just kind of start broadly. What is the masculine mandate? This is what Richard Phillips is saying, comes from the Bible. So what is it? What is the masculine mandate?
Yeah. So, guys, if you're listening, I mean, part of this is maybe even to help you figure out which books are really worth reading or
Hmm.
which ones you can listen in and just learn a bit from. So I'm gonna tell you kind of how he defines it. But again, if you're listening, this is the moment. If you could swipe past this video and move on to the next one, you probably would, because it's the definition is not particularly gripping. But what he describes as the masculine mandate is that we are to be spiritual men placed in real world, God defined relationships
Mhm.
as lords and servants under God to bear fruit by serving and leading.
Mm.
Now, again, that's kind of a fairly difficult definition. What he's really wanting to do is to try to go back into the early setting of Genesis, the garden, and to try to understand masculinity primarily from what we see there. And so when he says spiritual men, he means that, and Christians should know this, that like we've got to understand that God defines everything about our lives. We have that spiritual dimension, that we're placed in real world, God defined relationships. So this is something that you don't go necessarily like looking for, that actually, if you look around you, the key relationships and responsibilities that define masculinity, they're probably already situated right in your life. We kind of
Mm.
land in them, and then that we've got this role, and we can talk more about this later, but to be lords and servants under God, that
Mm.
actually there's a kind of leadership. There's a high dignity and responsibility that comes with the roles that men inherit within that setting.
Mm.
And so really, the book is again going into the garden, using that primarily as the most important paradigm for understanding who we are as men and what the distinctive kind of roles are that we inherit as part of God's creation.
All right, so you already gave a good distinctive there, especially on this book and its search for the meaning of manhood. You said in the garden. So you're talking, okay, this is using the Bible to try to help us identify what does it mean to be a man. So why would you say that it's important that men use the Bible to try to help us with this identity that men have, rather than just going on some self-serving quest of some sort?
Yeah, and I think this is where, as Christians, we want to believe what we do believe. The Bible speaks into the most profound of questions, and
Mm.
one of those is this identity question. But I think one thing that's interesting, some guys at various points will have come across John Eldredge has probably the most well-known Christian book on kind of masculinity,
Yeah.
Wild at Heart. Um, and a lot of Eldridge's book is kind of a calling to recover a kind of rugged masculinity,
Yeah.
to kind of go back into the wilderness, to not be afraid of um, the passions that men often have for a touch of danger, a touch of experiencing wilderness, and kind of seeing the wilderness as the context within which masculinity is largely lived out.
Mm.
And interestingly, this book is very much trying to be critical of that mindset,
Mm.
that we don't go out in the wilderness to become men, that actually what we see in the Bible is a call into the home. We see it in some ways, I think you can say this, a kind of domestication of men insofar as the primary places that we exhibit masculinity. It's not as hunters, it's not as builders in the Bible, it's as fathers, it's as husbands. And so that might in some ways raise some questions among some guys, but it's an interesting kind of response to that wild at heart mentality that has driven a lot of the conversation in Christian circles.
Yeah. So, all right, if I'm not looking out in the wild to find my identity or my job or my being or the things that I'm supposed to be doing, but I'm looking in the Bible for my responsibilities. I don't know, what sort of responsibilities does a man have?
And I think, again, if we're thinking of the garden, a few things come to mind. We're going to have to think about what it means to be image bearers.
Hmm.
That's going to be really important. Um, we're going to need, there's in Genesis 2, verse 15, we're told that man's put by God in the Garden of Eden to work and keep it,
Hmm.
tend and keep. And those two words are really important for this book, and I think important in the whole of the Bible. And so one of them has, they're very similar words, but one of them has more of a nurturing, cultivating sense.
Hmm.
The other has a little bit more of a protecting, guardianship sense. Um, but then equally, a third thing would be just man's not made to be alone, but we're told that God gives him, this helper, and we have marriage, begin in the garden. And so you put these things together, image bearing.
Hmm.
So part of the calling is going to have to do with, as we follow the biblical narrative, a kind of recovery of that image, a kind of sanctification, a kind of taking ownership of one's life and beginning to live according to the glory of God to one's full capacity. So that's going to be an aspect of what we're called to do. There's going to be a kind of tend and keep, cultivate, protect the ones under you. And that's going to involve, again, family. It's going to involve children, marriage.
Hmm.
Um, and so these are some of the areas. This is the sort of the context within which this masculinity is lived out. And that's the kind of garden setting that we find at the very beginning of the Bible.
All right, so you've mentioned a few things here. Just taking notes. There's kind of this identity piece, who am I, an image bearer kind of thing. There's also this like, what do I do? Tend and keep, and being a kind of a cultivator. And that's one of the things he talks about in the book is men being a cultivator. What does that mean? What does it mean for a man to be a cultivator?
Well, I think we tend to identify nurturing primarily with kind of the female sex,
Hmm.
that they're the nurturer. It makes more sense. We're the protector, the provider. And without saying that we're not the protector and provider, we are, but this balances it and I recognizes that we are called to cultivate. And so one of the things I think he does that is helpful is in the context, for example, of parenting or marriage, not just what does it mean to discipline your kid, but what does it look like to disciple your kid? Because that's cultivating them. What does
Yeah.
it look like, not just to protect your wife, but what does it look like to really know your wife, invest in your
Mm,
wife? And so to see that as part of our masculinity, that calling to nurture the things that we're responsible for, which includes relationships.
mm, mm. That's good. Okay, so another subject he brings up, yes, there's this idea of okay, we're called to tend and keep, and we talk about that in our home and in the relationships we have. But he does talk a good bit about work and our careers and our jobs, and he actually, surprisingly to me, he talked about it in a very positive way. Like he goes pretty strong on men were made for work, men were made to work, and you need to be working. He goes kind of in depth on that. So. What do you think he means, or what would you take away from his talking points on this idea that men were made to work?
There's a couple of things I think that have a real cultural relevancy. Stepping back for just a second, one, I mean, he's really strong, that we should get married. Now, that doesn't mean every man will get married. But if you think of all the guys that are happy to delay marriage because they want that independence, he would, and I think taking up this biblical position, say, no, your masculinity is developed within the context of marriage. And so, unless you have a specific call to be celibate,
Hmm.
then go find a wife. Similarly, I think with this work, we live in a culture that idolizes recreation, leisure, fun, freedom, the weekend, all of that stuff. And I think against that, what we see in the very beginning, before sin enters,
Hmm.
we see man created to work in the garden. And so that means that our both our human calling, but equally our masculine calling is going to need to involve work. And so we have to find productive spheres in which we don't just build a career, which is often just about ego and self-worth, but we actually that cultivating, we find ways to, in a sense, add worth or to bring out the worth of the world that God's created, or how to, benefit others around us and express the love that God, has called us to live out. So I think men need to realize that part of their masculine identity is to not live for Saturday night, be refreshed. Certainly we need to worship all the rest of it. We need to be creatures that find productive ways to be involved with God's creation.
Right. I want to press a little more into that one because this one was a big key point in the book for me. I love that idea, and I even light up to that idea of, yeah, men were made to work, and he even talks about, hey, finding enjoyment in your work, and that's a good thing. And I honestly, especially in Christian circles, rarely hear that kind of talk about work, because most of the time when we talk to men about work, we're saying stop making your career an identity. Stop worshiping your career, and we almost push back against work and the work men do, and we make it seem like a sort of evil. But the truth is, there is this bit of yes, enjoy your work and work hard. You were meant to work, but there is this part of like, wait, men do make their career a whole identity. They do make too much of their career. So I don't know. What do you do with that tension there?
Yeah, and I think where he's not particularly helpful is recognizing the kind of cultural forms that become ruts that are unhelpful. One of those in our society being the degree to which work defines us.
Yeah.
So, for every one man that there is, who's lazy and slothful and needs to be told to just go get a job,
Hmm.
there's another guy who is sacrificing his kids and his wife for the sake of his career. And so it would have been helpful to have a little bit more kind of critical thought about, okay, how do we live this calling out? Not necessarily as just a calling to a career, but what is just productive, useful, serving God in the context of work looks like. There's a little bit there, but I think there could be more, and guys are going to have to think about that a little bit harder. In some cases, in order to cut back from work and to recover the other things, family, worship that should also, define our lives as men.
So again, he in this book he kind of to me answers two questions, or approaches the idea of manhood in two questions, like who am I, and then this idea of what do I do. And in part of that who am I piece, he talks a good bit about being a shepherd, or shepherding, and that's a key role as a man. A biblical manhood includes shepherding. Why do you think that this idea of shepherding is integral for talking about men and the picture of a biblical man?
Yeah, so he doesn't hold punches in terms of it's a strong call for men to exert spiritual leadership
Mhm.
in the home, in their marriage. There are distinctions of roles. To be a father, to be a husband, is to be
Mhm.
given additional responsibility. And of course, as soon as you begin to talk about that, there's obvious danger, and the
Mhm.
danger of power becoming
Yes.
exerted in a way that is unhealthy and damaging to people around you. And so biblically, the main way that God teaches us how to leave or how to lead is with the image of that shepherd. And we see it, in the kings of Israel. We see it in the shepherding image used of God Himself. In like Psalm 23, it's a classic example. But what's beautiful about that is it combines that nurturing and that kind of protective element into one image. And so the shepherd, there's a wonderful picture in Isaiah 40 about God taking up the uh, the lamb in his arm and carrying it in his bosom. So there's that nurturing, that shepherd who will take up the weak lamb and look after it and make sure it's healed and fed and cared for. But equally, like with David, if there's a bear or a lion,
Mhm.
it's going to go and it's going to do whatever it takes to
Uh,
protect the flock.
uh,
And so that image, we got to have the strength of masculinity, which is what enables us to protect when needed, but
mhm.
with the soft touch of a shepherd who knows the needs and the weaknesses even of those that are following him.
I like that. And like, how do you, and you talked a little bit about this, but maybe how do you apply that then to the different relationships in a man's life? Okay. So this idea of the strength of a man, but that shepherding touch, whether it be to marriage or to be as being a father, or even I'd love to hear you talk about like just in church. He talks a little bit about that in the book. Like, what does it look like in these different spheres for men to act like that shepherd leader?
Guys who've done cross training, will probably be familiar with Colossians 3, but the Bible's amazing in that it often says so much with just a few words. And one of the things that's so interesting about Colossians 3 is Paul says very little to husbands and to fathers, but what he says is of such significance. So he says, husbands, love your wives, but then he adds, and do not be harsh with them.
Mm,
And what a danger that is if you're given some sort of leadership role. And so to learn to be meek and gentle like Jesus. And then he goes on and says, after he tells children to obey their parents, he says, fathers, do not provoke your children lest they become discouraged. And I mean, all of us, if we think back, we know the ability of a father to build us up with a word and make us feel like we can go conquer the world. But equally, with one like glance, it's just crushing that disappointment in the way that we can discourage. And so I think, we see there that real sensitivity as men, that we have to realize the role that we've been given, and it can be used for such good. Also, it can be used for such evil, and the same would go for church as well. And there's heavy-handed shepherding, which is a real danger. There's soft, kind of namby-pamby shepherding, which is also a problem.
yeah,
And so, having that spirit that's able to have that middle position, have all the strength, but equally all the gentleness. I mean, this is, guys, why are we having to train in spiritual fitness? Because these are virtues that take great wisdom, they take great meekness and humility to be able to begin to, fulfill.
All right, I want you to kind of give me just kind of an overall assessment of this book and what it teaches about masculinity to men, but I want you to do it in maybe a little more particular way. I want you to pretend you are talking to one of your sons and saying, "Hey, son, I want you to learn more about biblical masculinity. This book was, a source I read, and here's what I want you to see in this book, or here's maybe some things that maybe weren't clear." What would you tell your son in that case? Like, "Hey, here's the overall assessment of this book, and here's what I want you to see."
Yeah. I don't know that I would tell my son to read this book.
There you go.
Partly because good content, but I think the layout's a bit confusing.
Mm,
It's not as clear. I think it drifts into kind of broad discussions. It could be a marriage book, it could be other topical books. If you're asking about masculinity, I don't know that it's direct or clear enough.
yeah.
But I think that the really helpful element, and this is so biblical, this is why guys do need to think about this, the content of the book at least, is I would tell my son, let's go to Genesis 2.
Yeah.
Let's ask, what is the significance of the garden? That man is put in a covenantal environment. So from the very beginning, his life is defined in relation to God.
Hmm.
He's an under shepherd. He's under the authority of God, and in that role as an image bearer, he then has authority and responsibility.
Hmm.
What does it look like? And what does it mean that from the beginning we were called to work and to, in a sense, enter into creation and to do something productive? And what does it mean to be made not to live alone, but actually to find our fulfillment in a lifelong, committed, loving relationship with a woman? I think those kind of core insights from Genesis 2 offer men a whole lot more than they might realize in terms of beginning to get a framework. Now, that's not all the Bible says. And again, that's part of the problem with the book is there's other I would want to go other places in the Old Testament and
Yeah.
develop this idea of masculinity further. But those insights are wonderful insights. They're biblical insights. They're things that we need to pass on to our sons. There's things that we need to talk about, with guys in our churches.
No, and that's why we're going to continue and make this a series, Joe. We're not done. This is a whole conversation. There's a lot more, I think, that needs to be learned about being a man and what biblical masculinity is that can be found in one book. And so, yeah, we hope to explore that further down the line. We do, guys. We've got a kind of a series of a few books we're going to be, Joe and I, just personally as friends, are reading together and exploring together, and as fathers are wanting to learn more about what it is to be a man. And so as we do that, we're going to just share it with you. And so we look forward to those upcoming uh, future episodes. Is there any kind of final thoughts or anything that you want to share with guys as we close out this episode?
I would just say, guys, if there's a book that you want us to discuss, let us know.
Oh, that's
Send us a
dangerous,
message, send
Joe.
us an
That's
email, and we'd like
yes,
to know what you're reading and interacting with.
it's true. And oh, now all the lists of crazy books are going to come out. Way to go. You did it. You opened up the pipeline, Joe. We're gonna get so many crazy suggestions. No, please do email them. I want to know. I'll stick my email in the show notes. And yeah, I do enjoy reading books. So we'll see. I love your suggestions. Send them on. But we do look forward to doing another episode with you guys, talking about what does it mean to be a man, biblically speaking. What is biblical masculinity? So y'all join us next time.